Good morning. After a week when ordinary news has been paused, today it's bursting out again all over. Questions about vaccines and variants, tensions with Russia, and, of course, the latest in the lobbying scandals surrounding David Cameron. Rows about lobbying are nothing new. They always start with investigative journalists and then they spread to the front pages and the tops of bulletins. Sometimes there's a resignation. More often there isn't. But there are inquiries and bland promises of reform from all sides, a fresh start. And then nothing, it seems, really changes and we hang around waiting for the next scandal. Will the Greensill affair be any different? Let's try to find out. To help me today, I'm joined by David Cameron's friend and ex-advisor, himself a former lobbyist, the Environment Secretary, George Eustice. By the Labour frontbencher who has led the charge on this, the Shadow Cabinet Office Minister, Rachel Reeves. As surge testing takes place in parts of Britain to track down new cases of coronavirus variants, I'll be talking to Dr. Susan Hopkins from Public Health England. And as election campaigning resumes, I'll be talking to Sir Ed Davy, leader of the Liberal Democrats and a minister in David Cameron's coalition government, to the Conservative leader in Wales, Andrew Davies, and to the co-leader of the Green Party, Jonathan Bartley. With tensions between Britain and Russia seemingly getting worse by the day, I've also been talking to the man summoned by the Foreign Office for addressing down the Russian ambassador to Britain, Andrey Kelin. And we'll end with the Poet Laureate talking about his tribute to the Duke of Edinburgh. So it's a very busy morning. We'll be running a little longer than usual, reviewing the news, Jane Moore of The Sun, and our own political correspondent who specialises in the world beyond Westminster, Alex Forsyth. But let's begin with the news headlines and Roger Johnson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. The Queen and the nation have bid farewell to the Duke of Edinburgh. Prince Philip was laid to rest at St George's Chapel in Windsor yesterday. The royal family paid tribute to the Duke's humour and humanity. The service was restrained in line with the Duke's wishes and coronavirus guidelines. Due to social distancing regulations, the Queen sat alone. The funeral came just days before Her Majesty turns 95. It's the first weekend since lockdown eased in England. There might be a few sore heads this morning after people up and down the country took the chance to spend Saturday evening wining and dining in the sunshine with family and friends. What was once the world's largest iceberg has finally broken apart. A68, as it was known, covered an area of nearly 2,300 square miles when it broke away from Antarctica in 2017. And there will be no quadruple for Manchester City this year after Chelsea beat them 1-0 in their FA Cup semi-final at Wembley yesterday. That's all from me for this morning. Next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Many thanks. One story really only on all the front pages and one thought. The Queen left alone. Alone in her grief, says the Sunday People. I'm not going to show all the Sunday front pages because basically they have the same idea. I'd say to anyone who is not interested in yesterday's funeral, two things. First, you're wrong. There's a lot to reflect on and a lot to learn. And second, avoid the Sunday papers, because that is almost all there is. There are other stories. The Observer has the Greensill story on the front page. The Sunday Times has a kind of collector's edition wrap-around beautiful picture of St George's Chapel there. But there's an awful lot about the royal family in detail and about the funeral in detail. Now, we've got lots to talk about, but we are going to move on to some of the other political stories. Before we do that, we're going to start with, of course, the funeral itself. Jane Moore, you were observing the whole thing for The Sun. Just give us your reflections on the best pieces in the papers and what we learn.
Well, as you say, I mean, the coverage is completely across every single paper. I think the most kind of moving picture is the one of the Queen sitting alone. Yep. of course, because she's lost her partner in life, but also because of the pandemic, she had to remain socially distanced from the rest of the family who aren't in her bubble. So that was particularly poignant. But for me, it was an incredibly personal funeral for a member of the royal family. I mean, Prince Philip is well known that he was the one who first sort of encouraged the royal family to be on television, to be more accessible to the people that they represent. He pioneered walkabouts, that kind of thing. So, and he very much planned his own funeral, and
he
his
was
expressed
the sort of choreographer, the master of music, and the designer of all of this. It was, in a sense, his own last act.
It absolutely was, and he wanted it to be of the plainest. This is an exact quote: the plainest and most private character. And I think it really felt like that. You know, from the Land Rover to the family walking behind the coffin, and it just felt very, very intimate. It felt like we were there. And for my colleague Arthur Edwards, who is kind of like the legendary Sun photographer, he's in his 80s now, and he's covered the royal family for over 50, maybe even 60 years. And there was a delicious little detail that the Duke of Edinburgh, and I didn't know this or even notice it until I saw it this morning, at the top of the stairs to the chapel, you'll see two pillars, and the one on the left, it looks like a sort of a bird watching keep or whatever you call them, with a little slit in. And Arthur Edwards at the behest of Edinburgh was inside that pillar, getting that sort of bird's eye view, if you like, of all of the royal family as they came up the steps. So a delightful
an extraordinary man, Arthur Edwards, and as you say, he's been there all the way through the story, almost all the way through the story. Alex, an awful lot, of course, written in all the papers today. Is there anything else anything new that we learn really from the papers in their coverage?
You're right. There is extensive coverage, as you might expect. There's an awful lot about what this means for the royal family as well, and what kind of transition this might mark. But it's worth noting that while this was an incredibly intimate funeral in many ways, not least because of the COVID restrictions, it was a moment of a public moment of unity as well. And if you just look at this, it
caught people's imaginations in a way perhaps we hadn't expected, didn't it?
Absolutely. And even though people were urged to stay away from Windsor, they still went. When there was that moment's silence, we had images in the papers today of people bowing their heads. So I think it obviously touched people, and perhaps not least after a year where a lot of people have had their own personal grief and had to mourn in a very similarly restricted way. So a moment for the family, but also a moment for the country.
Let's move on to some of the other stories then, because the COVID story and the Cameron story are still very, very big here. You've chosen a great big double-page spread and some extraordinary detail there about the latest stage of the Cameron lobbying scandal. And I was really interested in there because this is mostly about lobbying a crucial civil servant who, surprise, surprise, had been to school with David Cameron, and Cameron is very friendly and saying, let's have lunch after the COVID crisis is over. It shows you that his relations with former civil servants, current civil servants, former ministers, current ministers, it's not normal. He is still a big authority figure.
Yeah, this is the Sunday Times. They've got these emails who David Cameron wrote to Matthew Gold, who's the head of the NHS's digital arm, effectively lobbying on behalf of Green Sill again. And you're right, there is a huge amount of detail in this, and there's a huge amount of detail in all the papers about various allegations around this. But I think what's interesting is that the potential damage from this doesn't necessarily come from those following the twists and turns and detail very closely. It doesn't even come from the fact that people have broken the rules, because in many cases they haven't. There's been no wrongdoing as per the rules. It is about a potentially damaging perception of a world of power, wealth and influence, which is very far removed from most people's ordinary lives.
The damage is real. It's a damage to politics and the parliamentary system, but it's not measurable. You can't actually see it. We just have to imagine it. A very interesting piece by Bernard Jenkins, one of the more senior Conservative backbenchers, weighing in quite forcibly in The Observer.
He's making exactly that point, but this has got the potential to really cause some political problems for the government. He warns Boris Johnson that the Red Wall voters, those former Labour seats that fell to the Conservatives in 2019, he says they will dismiss him unless he can show he's more open and very different from the out-of-touch elite he defeated in the 2016 referendum. And that is, of course, now Labour making big push of this, what they call Tory sleaze. It is the challenge now for this government how they respond and handle whether or not they can get through to voters that perhaps there is a new regime in place, or whether this really does tarnish the political class in a potentially damaging way.
And I should say the Mail on Sunday has an interesting piece alleging that there are Labour moles inside the government machine at the heart of Number 10 feeding Keir Starmer this stuff. We don't know if it's true or not, but it's an interesting thought at any rate. Jane, of course, across most of the country, people are thinking much more about opening up and all those sunny pub gardens. I was in one yesterday and very nice it was too. Just talk about the coverage, not about me, but about the coverage.
Well, you were among them there. Yes, all over the country, Leeds, Manchester. I mean, the papers are full of revellers having a wonderful time, not looking terribly socially distanced in some of the photographs, but, you know, that's young people for you. But yeah, I mean, we should remember that 29,000 pubs remain closed because they don't have enough space. So we have to think about them and how they're going to open effectively on May the 17th and of course, remain safe. Shops as well, high streets were very busy. 1.6 billion apparently was spent by 18.4 million shoppers. So the appetite was very much there, that everybody wanted to get out and about. Let's hope it's not just a novelty, because these pubs and these shops and all of these retail outfits need our support.
Well, there's a lot of heart searching these days about what does it mean to be British. And the one thing we know about ourselves is we do love to shop. And once we're out to shop, people are out buying stuff they don't need in huge quantities and keeping the economy going. And I suppose that's all a very good thing. Alex, can I ask you a little bit about pubs? Because there's a real worry in the hospitality industry, pubs and restaurants, about whether their reopening green light will be on condition of them accepting vaccine passports. So you have to show that you've been vaccinated before you're allowed in. This is causing a really important and quite big political row, but it very much worries pubs up and down the country.
Yeah, it's an idea that's been kicking around, in which the government acknowledges it is exploring. It says it won't be a vaccine passport so much as some sort of COVID certificate, which shows effectively you're not infectious. So whether it's you've recently had it, so you've got antibodies, you get a negative test, or you've had a vaccination. There hasn't been a final decision on that yet. And it's worth noting that in the papers today, they're talking about some of the pilots that are being run, looking at opening up indoor venues where you get people congregating. So we've seen fans back at the Crucible. We've got the FA Cup semi-final this afternoon. There's a concert happening in Liverpool. These are not with passports per se. They are instead with negative tests, but no social distancing. The government will be looking very closely, I think, at the outcome. It's an experiment. We'll see what happens. Pilot / experiment, Andrew.
Alex, thanks very much. Jane, of all the actors I've interviewed on this programme, Helen McCrory was one of the most delightful, enjoyable, giving people that I've come across. She died, of course, very sadly from cancer. Her husband, Damien Lewis, has written in the Sunday Times a beautiful piece, it has to be said.
He has. It's really, really lovely. And it was such a shock, I think, for everybody. It just kind of popped up on the news. She kept it very, very private. She gave television interview only last month. And somebody said, you know, the interviewer said to her, why do you sound so hoarse? And she just said, I have children. Which I thought was a great answer. But Damien's done this lovely piece. He hasn't really focused on her career, because everybody has done that, of course. He's focused on her as a person and how immensely kind she was. And I love a thing. He said that she was treated at the Royal Marsden Hospital, an amazing hospital. And the nurses said to him that they looked forward to her coming in because she made their day better. Yeah. So that is a very, very special kind of person. And she was also very humorous. She said to him and the children in her final days, don't be sad. I've lived the life that I wanted to. And she said, I want Daddy to have girlfriends and lots of them. But she said, if you could just get through my funeral without snogging somebody, that would be great. So a little bit of...
A great sense of humour.
Yeah.
Helen McCrory, who we lost far too early. Jane, Alex, thanks both very much indeed. And so to the weather. Now, there's a word I am very rarely able to use, but I feel today that I can. It is glorious. There you go, hostage to fortune. Over to Louise Lear in the weather studio. Louise.
For all, no, not unfortunately. Glorious for some, but it is a beautiful, dry story across England and Wales, and you can see absolutely lovely. But unfortunately, there is some cloud and some rain around, just spoiling the weather story a little, with some light patchy rain moving through Scotland, Northern Ireland and northwest England. And here, that will tend to linger throughout much of the day. But where we have got the sunshine and we've got those light winds, well, the temperatures are going to respond. They will be a degree or so up on yesterday. We could see highs of 16 degrees, and with the sunshine quite strong now at this time of year, that's going to feel pleasant. A little cooler underneath the cloud and the rain, but that weather front actually reverts its way back to the northwest and then allows a good deal of dry weather to continue through the night. We could see some low clouds and mist and fog just pushing in off the North Sea, affecting East Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Elsewhere, it's a relatively quiet night and temperatures not as low as they have been. As we move into tomorrow, that weather front still sitting out in the Atlantic, but really just producing the odd spot or two into the Western Isles and maybe a little more cloud through northwest Scotland and Northern Ireland. Elsewhere, we keep that light southerly breeze. Lots of sunshine expected tomorrow, Andrew, and that sunshine even further north into Scotland. So highest values tomorrow of 17 Celsius.
That's not too shabby. Thanks very much, Louise. Now, my first guest this morning is Labour's Shadow Cabinet Office Minister, Rachel Reeves. Rachel Reeves, you've been making hay with the Greensill affair in the House of Commons. You lost a vote, of course, the Labour Party, on this. I've been trying to count them up. I think that there are at least 6 inquiries in this going on now. What more do you really want?
Well, thank you for having me on, Andrew. Look, what we've seen this week is that Tory sleaze is back and that it's bigger than ever. And we need real change to restore trust in our democracy and in the very essence of public service, which matters to so many of us and matters to people in our country. What we want to see, we wanted this week, and that's why we had a vote on it, to have a proper inquiry, not chaired by one of Boris Johnson's friends. A very close friend of the Conservative Party is Nigel Boardman, who's doing the review, but a proper independent inquiry that has teeth and has a chance to make recommendations on how to clean this up, because this isn't just about Greensill. Greensill is the tip of the iceberg. There's a £2 billion of contracts that have gone to friends and donors of the Conservative Party. This whole growing feeling that there's one rule for those at the top and another for everybody else that we need to root out of our politics.
So there are rules at the moment. There's an advisory committee called ACBOA, which looks at ministers, ACOBA, looks at ministers and business connections. Is it at least essential that everybody abides by that?
Yes, absolutely. But there are other things that are needed as well. So Sir Alex Allen resigned last November as the independent advisor on ministerial interests. For 5 months, we haven't had anyone in that crucial role. Okay. So Jonathan Evans, who is the chairman of the Commission on Standards on Public Life, said yesterday that whoever takes on that role, and we hope they're going to be announced this week, should have the power to instigate inquiries. At the moment, you have to have the get-go of the Prime Minister to even be able to start an inquiry, which is why we never had an inquiry into Robert Jenrick's relationship with Richard Desmond and the planning application that he put through. So Alex Allen needs to be replaced.
Lots of things
and needs
to
have
talk
proper
about.
Powers and independence.
Let's stick, if we may, with the Advisory Committee on Ministerial Business Appointments, ACBOA. You said it was essential that people abided by that. Can I ask you, therefore, about Carwyn Jones, the former First Minister of Wales, Labour former First Minister of Wales? He took a job with Liberty Steel's parent company. Now, Liberty Steel is completely connected to the Greensill affair. He was told by ACBOA he could not take that job, and yet he did. What's your response?
Well, his role at Liberty was particularly around energy issues and steel issues, and had no connection to what was going on at Greensill. The Greensill stuff only came out later. They were funding Liberty. That's not who Carwyn Jones was working for.
Well,
and you know, when we're here today because of sleaze at the heart of government, because of David Cameron's lobbying for private interest, because he stood to gain tens of millions of pounds through his lobbying if he had succeeded.
So you say the Carwyn Jones thing doesn't matter or whatever. ACOBA wrote to Mr Jones in these terms, and this is a direct quote: "The committee considers that joining the GFG Alliance, which is the body concerned, Global Advisory Board, whilst you are subject to the government's business appointment rules, is contrary to its advice. You are in breach of the government's business appointment rules," and he ignored them. Why do you think he ignored them?
Well, look, that's something for you to ask Carwyn Jones. I can't answer that question. But we are here today because of sleaze engulfing the government at the heart of what is going on in government. Look, I would like Sir Eric Pickles and the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments to have more powers.
To go after Carwyn Jones, to go after perhaps Mark Drayford, who agreed that he didn't have to, that he could ignore these rules.
Well, look, I think there are different rules in place in Wales compared with the government in the United Kingdom. And Carwyn Jones was not had any relationship at all with Greensill, and he was not lobbying government ministers. I think this is the crucial point, Andrew. This is the crucial point here, that he wasn't lobbying. He wasn't lobbying for commercial interests of Welsh ministers or of British government ministers. That is very different from what we've seen from David Cameron, who was directly lobbying the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who set up 10 meetings for David Cameron and Greensill with government officials, or the private drink that he had with Matt Hancock, and then went on to get the contract to pay NHS workers early. When I say a contract, it didn't even go out to tender. So this is about commercial lobbying, not about just what roles you take up, but about how you use those roles to further your own interests.
I'm not suggesting that this isn't really serious. It plainly is. What I am suggesting is that when you say it's Tory sleaze, that's not quite fair. Labour is at it too, with the example I've just given you, and people can remember back to the Blair years and Steve Byers saying he was a cab for hire and all of that. Both parties have been involved in this. There is a problem in the system that involves you both, and it starts with Labour politicians saying, do you know what, it has been us too, and we're really sorry, and the whole system needs to change.
Look, Andrew, I don't want any stone to go unturned in these investigations, but let's be clear. Standards have fallen so far in the last 11 years under this Conservative government. Tory sleaze is back. It is bigger than ever, and we are seeing the erosion of trust in our politics because of the behaviour by a few at the top of the Conservative Party. And with lobbying, let me just say this, Andrew, with lobbying, it takes two to tango. For every person doing the lobbying, there is someone in power today who is willing to take those calls, to have those drinks, to push those boundaries. That is what is happening.
To be fair to the
government.
Chancellor, in this occasion, no money followed. So they didn't do what David Cameron wanted them to do.
Let's be clear about what Rishi Sunak did. And I look forward to Rishi Sunak giving evidence in public to these committees. Rishi Sunak set up a series of 10 meetings for Greensill with Treasury officials. Where were the meetings for the 3 million people who were excluded from financial support for this government? They didn't get those meetings. Why didn't they get those meetings? Because they didn't have the telephone number and the WhatsApp details of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. David Cameron did. He pushed the Chancellor and the Health Secretary to do special favours for them, and they rolled over and went with it.
You have proposed a new lobbying register, and you say you are quite relaxed about the trade unions being involved in that register because of their influence on the Labour Party. Is that now Labour policy?
Well, look, this is about commercial lobbying in private interest. Let's look at what the trade unions have done this year. They have pushed the government to put in support for furlough. But you want them on the lobbying register, don't you? What the trade unions have done this year is push for proper support for furloughed workers. They're pushing now for a pay rise for NHS workers.
But you want them on the lobbying register?
Already trade unions.
Do you want
already trade unions have to sign up to a tougher set of restrictions than commercial lobbyists.
None of which is relevant to my question,
crazy.
which is, do you want them on the lobbying register, yes or no?
Well, look.
If the answer is yes, which the answer gave you before, is that Labour policy?
What I have said is that it is important that no stone goes unturned. But the trade unions are a force for good in this country, and in the last year they have been pushing for the rights of working people, and they are essential for a healthy democracy. What is not essential for a healthy democracy is former prime ministers touting themselves around, lobbying, serving ministers today to secure tens of millions of pounds. Trade unions are a force for good in this country.
Thank you very much indeed. We will carry on overturning, unturning stones. Anyway, as well as national elections in Scotland and Wales, there are local elections coming up in England too. I'll be interviewing some of the party leaders, and you can find a full list of people standing on the BBC website. Sir Ed Davy, once a minister in David Cameron's coalition cabinet, is leader of the Liberal Democrats. Sir Ed, you were a minister with David Cameron. You know the man well. Has he done anything wrong?
Well, let's see the result of these 6 investigations. I don't like the sound of it. We need much greater transparency, as David Cameron himself once called for. I mean, let's remember what happened here. David Cameron secretly texted the Chancellor. He had a secret meeting with the health secretary to lobby for his financier mate, Lex Greensill. That isn't transparent, and it should be. And in the context of...
So he did do something wrong. He did do something wrong. Andrew,
whether it's in the rules or not, it ought to be in the rules. That's my point. We need much more greater transparency, where conflicts of interest need to be exposed. And I'd actually go further. Yeah. I'm worried about what the Chancellor did, what the Health Secretary did.
Well, let's talk, if we may, about you yourself, because you worked for a lobbying company when you left government. And when you were in government, in the Liberal Democrats, you said, as a party, you were going to clear up the lobbying problem. And yet you didn't. You didn't do anything about it in government. My question is simple. Why not?
Well, I never lobbied government. Let's make that absolutely clear. And I think we did do a lot of measures to try to clean up British politics.
Well, clearly not enough.
Time in government. Well, yeah, I would favour more. Let me give you one idea. I'm very worried that the Ministerial Code isn't properly enforced. We've seen Alex Allen, the independent advisor of ministerial standards, resign and not being reappointed. I'd like to see an independent body enforcing the Ministerial Code, not the Prime Minister. That's wrong. It's wrong that a politician should be the judge and jury of who decides who's broken the Ministerial Code. And what I'd like to see is an independent body, just like we had IPSA over MPs' pay and expenses, but an independent body that could say this minister has broken the code and therefore they can't have their ministerial pay. That would be a sort of penalty that I think the public would like, and it would rebuild trust in British politics.
Would you yourself work for a lobbying company again?
Well, I told you before, I didn't lobby government. I was working on renewable energy, advising people about renewable energy policies. Because I'm so committed to tackling climate change, in and out of Parliament, in and out of government, I think people should be working to improve our climate. And I'll tell you, this is quite sensitive, actually, Andrew, just so you know. One of the reasons I still work for a renewable company, and it's declared totally transparently on my register of members' interests, is partly because of climate change, but also I have a disabled son who will need 24/7 care when I've gone, and I'm quite an old dad. So, I mean, I think families everywhere will want to do the best for their children. And, you know, I have to support my son, who will need that for the rest of his life.
So you are, among other things, of course, facing your first electoral challenge, really, as leader of the Liberal Democrats. At the moment, you're kind of level pegging with the Green Party. You've mentioned climate change a lot yourself just now. Do you have to do better than the Green Party in these elections to keep your job?
Well, I think we're going to have a good night. I think we're going to move forward. I think we're going to make gains from Labour and the Conservatives. And the reason is, I think our message of a fairer, greener, more caring country is actually resonating. One thing the pandemic has done, it's reconnected people with their communities. And Liberal Democrats are known the countrywide as classic community politicians who listen to the community and get things done for their community. So I think that message that we want to help on the high street, so small businesses get further. That message is
mentioned the high street.
I think we will make gains at the next at these elections.
You mentioned the high street and you mentioned listening. There are in this country 29,000 pubs which will not be able to reopen at the moment and are really, really desperate to know whether they can continue as businesses at all. The Liberal Democrats are so far resolutely against the idea of vaccine passports, which is their route to reopening. Doesn't that mean that your civil libertarian principles are trumping the rights of many people, many of them Lib Dem voters, no doubt, to keep their own businesses afloat?
Well, first of all, you're right, Andrew. Liberal Democrats are totally opposed to these COVID ID cards, and we're opposed because they are unnecessary, they're expensive and they're divisive. And if you talk to the pubs that you mentioned, they don't want them. The Beer and Pub Association.
No,
well,
it may be their only way of opening, though. It may be their only way to survive.
Well, I don't know about you. I said our Liberal Democrats listen to the community, and we're listening to the industry and business, and they're saying they don't want these, whether it's the representatives of pubs, whether it's representatives of cinemas, whether it's the representatives of nighttime. They are saying that their businesses in large majorities think these will be very expensive and unworkable, and Liberal Democrats agree with that. This is unnecessary to reopen our society. Look at other countries, they've done it differently, and I think the government should focus the money that's available on making sure the test, trace and isolate system really works. They failed miserably on that, partly because they've got the tracing wrong, but mainly because they haven't supported people to isolate. So if we're going to recover from this pandemic, build that fairer, greener, more caring country that Liberal Democrats want, we don't need to take away people's freedoms.
Very important. Sir Ed Davy, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us today. Now then, 1 in 6 UK adults are fully vaccinated against COVID, and levels of infection are back to where they were in September last year, which is good news. But could the arrival of new variants that evade some of those protections from the vaccines knock the Prime Minister's roadmap off course? Susan Hopkins is Chief Medical Advisor for NHS Test and Trace. I started by asking her, as the data looks so good, will indoor hospitality open as planned on May the 17th?
So I think we've seen really positive progress over the last month. However, the data from ONS is always a look back. So it's looking a week or so behind us. And of course, the major first step in unlocking happened on April the 12th. So it will be the data that ONS show in the next 2 to 3 weeks that will really tell us how we're progressing. We can see right now that the numbers of cases that we've got in the community are at our lowest levels since September last year. But as we release restrictions and as people start moving around again, then transmission can occur. So people need to take caution as they do that. We really hope that the next step can take place as planned. But as we've always said, we will look very carefully at the data, and we need 2 to 3 weeks of data at least after each unlocking to be able to assess the impact of that.
One of the big problems at the moment is the variants. Can I ask you first of all about the South African variant? Have we got community transmission of that? In other words, is it transmitting from people, person to person, from people who haven't been to South Africa, inside Britain?
Yeah, so we have seen a small amount of community transmission. About 2/3 of all of the cases that we've seen with South Africa are related to travel. So either people who've come back from travel themselves directly or are transmitted to their household contacts. However, in pockets around the country, we have seen transmission, and that's what we're trying to stop and find the cases when we deliver what we call surge testing, where we go in and ask communities to come forward and test. The largest cluster that we've seen of community transmission has happened in South London, where we've seen 44 confirmed cases and 30 probable cases that the cases in their households are close contacts that have also had a positive test.
And
that's why we're asking all of London to come forward.
We've heard about the examples in London and in Birmingham. Is it anywhere else?
So we've seen small pockets of transmission in other parts of the country as well, particularly urban centres like Manchester, Birmingham, London. But outside of that, there's really very, very low amounts of transmission in the rest of the country, or none.
And has anybody with the South African variant been vaccinated beforehand or had the earlier version of COVID beforehand? In other words, I'm asking about reinfection.
Yeah, so we have seen some people who've had their first dose of vaccine who have had the South African variant, and also our own B117, the variant that arose in Kent. And that's to be expected. We know that these vaccines aren't 100% at protecting you against infection, and that's why we still ask people to take caution and hands face to face. We know that in the vast majority of it will reduce your risk of infection by about 70% after the first dose, but that leaves a large amount of people still able to get the infection and transmit to others.
So I suppose the really big question underlying all of this is whether the 3 vaccines that we've got at the moment, the Oxford vaccine, Pfizer and Moderna, are actually effective against the variants. That's the crucial question, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, we've got some small amounts of data from South Africa where some of these trials were held, and you can see that they're not as good against the B1351, the variant that arose in South Africa, as they are against our own B117 at preventing infection and transmission. However, it is highly likely that these will be very effective at reducing hospitalizations and deaths because it is a primer for your immune system. So when your immune system is then exposed to a variation of the same virus, it responds faster and more adequately to protect you against severe disease. That's similar to how we see it with flu. So people who've had influenza previously or repeated vaccine seem to have less severe disease than those who haven't had a vaccine before.
Well, that is reassuring. Let me ask you about another variant people are talking about at the moment, which is the Indian variant. Is the community transmission of that in Britain yet?
So we have seen a couple of cases that have not arisen from travel, but we're still trying to undergo the investigations to look in great detail about where they might have acquired it from. Often it may have been an individual that they hadn't realised had travelled previously, or have been in a place where there was a case which had travelled previously. So those are the sort of investigations that we're looking at. The vast majority of the cases we have confirmed know that they have come from India and are tested on the day 2 or day 8 of their isolation period, showing that the isolation testing is really an effective measure of finding these cases and preventing onward transmission. The majority of these people are asymptomatic.
But it also leads to the obvious question, shouldn't India be put on the red list for travel now?
So the red list decisions are based on the government looking at a range of complex measures, including the whether it's a variant of concern. We have not got enough data about this variant yet to be able to clarify that it is a variant of concern. We have put it as a variant under investigation. To escalate it up the ranking, we need to know that it's increased transmissibility, increased severity, or vaccine evading. And we just don't have that yet, though we're looking at the data on a daily basis. We will also be talking to our colleagues in India and seeing if they will share a sample with us so that we can do lab studies as we have done for the other variants. And that gives us a much more detailed information about how we expect the immune system to respond.
You've talked already about the importance of mass testing in trying to track down these variants, but there's been a lot of criticism this week of the lateral flow tests, and particularly the problem of false positives. Can I ask you when we're going to see some data on how many people have taken those tests, how many false positives there's been, and how many people have then self-isolated? Because most of us are completely in the dark, really, about the lateral flow tests and the mass testing regime, and we kind of need more data.
So we're releasing the data on lateral flow tests on a daily basis, the number positive, the number with PCR confirmation on the coronavirusdata.gov.uk dashboard. So people can see the real-time changes in that data there. The more detailed analysis of the data, much of that has been released from the early studies that we did, including from Liverpool, from the studies that we did comparing it to PCR tests. And we keep producing that data on a regular basis. We plan to have further reports looking in detail on schools, the early data from the schools from the 3 weeks before half term. What I would say is that the lateral flow test and the data that we have show that the vast majority of people who have a positive lateral flow test go on, if they take a PCR test, to have a positive PCR test. More than 3 in 4 people, in fact.
But that last point you just made about how many people are actually self-isolating after these tests is absolutely critical. That's what we really need. But you're saying the vast majority of people are self-isolating.
So when they're contacted as part of contact tracing, which is what we do in all of the individuals who test positive, then the people are already isolating. And so, you know, that is a positive confirmation that they're taking the right actions to prevent transmission. I don't think that people actually think, I've done this test and I don't need to isolate. If they've gone to the step of doing a test and they get a positive result, as with the majority of things in this world, the vast majority of people do the right thing.
Dr. Susan Hopkins, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Ahead of the Welsh elections next month, I'm speaking to some of the party leaders there, and today it's Andrew RT Davies, who leads the Welsh Conservatives. He joins me now from Cardiff. Welcome, Mr. Davies. Can I ask you about your attitude to the Senedd? Independence is more popular in Wales now than it's been for a very long time, up to 39% in some of the polling. Do you actually want to abolish the Senedd?
Well, good morning, Andrew. No, I don't. I believe the Senedd and the Welsh Parliament can be a power for good if it has the right government coming out of it. And that government, obviously, would be a Welsh Conservative government. You'd expect me to say that. If the Welsh rugby team is performing badly on the pitch, you don't get rid of the Welsh rugby team or the WRU. You change the coach. And that's what we have the opportunity to do in these elections, is to change the coach. And Labour have been running Wales for the last 22 years with obvious outcomes of failures in most public sectors.
Well, I'm asking, I suppose, because you have not one, not two, but three candidates in these elections who say explicitly they do want to get rid of the Senedd, and that policy is also popular among Welsh Conservatives. 60% of your members, according to one poll, want to get rid of the Senedd. Isn't that the way that your party is going?
No, not at all. We want to put the Welsh Parliament to good use and make sure that it improves lives across the whole of Wales by improving job prospects, by putting on the ballot paper the opportunity to vote for a party that's talking about creating 65,000 jobs, putting on the ballot paper the opportunity for people to vote for a party that wants to create 1,200 doctors, 3,000 nurses or 5,000 teachers. That's what good is about, not creating constitutional chaos by setting up referendums either to abolish the Welsh Parliament or to create independence. We've just come out of the worst 12 months we've ever seen in this country through the pandemic, and any government that forms after May the 6th, big job for the next 5 years will be making sure we deliver on the economy, we deliver on health, and we deliver on the environment. Those are the important big ticket items we need to be delivering on.
You mentioned the pandemic there. Now, if you look at the polling, the Welsh people are really quite happy with Mark Drayford's handling of that. 7 out of 10 say the Welsh Government have dealt with the pandemic well or very well. Now, you want to align policy more with London, and yet only 4 out of 10 of the English say the same about the London government. Surely you are, as it were, supporting the wrong team in this stadium.
No, what we're looking at here is the inability of the Welsh Government to have a clear roadmap out of the pandemic. We fully understand the public health reasons why lockdown came in, but because of the success of the vaccination programme, we've seen the Welsh Government take different approaches for the sake of being different rather than where the science points to have commonality in the rules and regulations. Outdoor hospitality is a good example of that. You can stand on the border and step across just into England and you can see outdoor hospitality working, whereas in Wales it's not working. The science is the same, but yet regrettably in Wales the Welsh Labour Government have chosen to take a different path. So, in education, for example, schools were opened in one go at the beginning of March. Sadly in Wales, years 7, 8 and 9 didn't get that education and that uplift in their education prospect because Wales kept schools shut until April the 12th. That's to the detriment of pupils' well-being here in Wales.
So what Welsh businesses want to know, I'm absolutely sure, is a bit of clarity. Would you, if you win these elections, will you follow Boris Johnson and make an absolute personal commitment to all social distancing measures ending on June the 21st in Wales?
If the science proves that to be the case, because like Boris Johnson, it's based on the science and on the data. And there's a roadmap that's been put in place. And in the absence of the Welsh Government having a roadmap that is coherent and delivers for the people of Wales wherever you live, we believe it's sensible to align those priorities to other parts of the United Kingdom where the science stacks up. So it's led by science, it's led by data. And if that proves to be the case on June the 21st, that's what we'd like to do.
Andrew Davies, thanks very much indeed for talking to us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now then, British relations with Russia could hardly be worse. The imprisoned opposition leader Andrei Navalny is said by his supporters this morning to be just days away from death. As America imposes new sanctions, Russian troops are massing on the border with Ukraine. Dominic Raab said, "We see what Russia is doing to undermine our democracies. The UK and US are calling out Russia's malicious behaviour." I sat down with the Russian ambassador to the UK, Andrey Kelin, on Friday, and I began by asking him what he makes of Mr. Raab's comments.
If Dominic Raab is really seeing how Russia interferes or demolishes democracy, please, I am ready to discuss it with him. But I haven't seen Secretary Raab for more than a year.
You have been summoned in multiple times by the Foreign Office to be rebuked. Why do you think the British government is so worried about Russians' behaviour?
It's a big question for me, I should say. When I have come here a year and some months ago, I was full of aspirations that we can do better. But in the recent year, relations has become worse, even more, I would say, even worse.
Right. Can I ask you about the Ukraine, where Russia has 40,000 troops now on the border. Ukraine. What are they there for?
First of all, inside the Ukraine, on the line of demarcation between the self-proclaimed republics, Donbass and all of that, and there are about 60,000 of Ukrainian troops. And Ukraine continue to build up troops.
Defending their own territory?
No. It's on the line inside the Ukraine, on the line which is separating Donetsk, Lugansk, and the rest of this country. 60,000 troops. And this build-up continues. My personal understanding that we are moving troops, just to give to understand to the Ukraine, that it is not priceless that if they will decide to advance on this territory and to make a bloodbath on it. This is one thing.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you'll have seen the film and the images of what's being moved towards that border. And it's not simply normal troops. It's tanks, it's armoured car carriers, it's field hospitals, and it's long-range communications. This looks like the beginning of an invasion.
Not at all. This is a normal military preparedness exercise, absolutely normal, which will be conducted, by the way...
Why the field hospitals? Why the long-range communications?
Okay, I'm not sure how the maneuvers, which are called Defender Europe, will be conducted in May and June, but it will be the most big exercises during the recent 15 years. And NATO is supposed to assemble more than 30,000 troops on the border of Russia, close to it, border of Russia and Ukraine, also assembling tanks, vehicles, blinded vehicles, and all of that stuff. I'm not sure, do not know about the hospitals. Probably yes, probably not. But of course, we need to be prepared for that, and we need to give to understand that we are prepared, that Russian army is prepared for that.
James, the defence analysts, say that you're deploying Iskander short-range ballistic missiles belonging to the Missile Brigade, that there's an enormous amount of high value and aggressive manoeuvring going on right on the border. I suppose the question is, why so much now? It's about a tenth of Russia's entire forces on the border with Ukraine or in the Crimea. It's a huge amount.
Minister of Defense has said that these are exercises, and this is not forever. And after 2 weeks, it will be other military exercises, I'm sure, in the other region. But our country is very big, and we have to know how to operate it from the east to west and how to move troops around. And it depends, of course, on general staff, which troops are supposed to be moved and how and why. We are doing it on our territory, and we do not need anyone to ask or to say how and why we are doing it.
It just sounds and looks quite aggressive and ominous. The deputy head of your presidential administration says this: the start of military action would be the beginning of the end of Ukraine. Doesn't that build up a picture of either intimidation or full-scale aggression coming?
Minister of Foreign Affairs and also spokesman by the President has repeatedly said, and I can confirm it, that we have no intention at all to be aggressive or and we do not threat to any country, including the Ukraine. We are fully committed to an idea of the Minsk agreements, and it should be reached only in a negotiated way.
So why that ominous, menacing phrase, the beginning of the end of Ukraine?
Probably it has been mentioned in certain context. I haven't seen the context, but I can imagine that if Ukrainian forces or Ukrainian government will decide to move troops in Donbass and to make a bloodbath over there, to kill people, to kill Russians, of course, we are going to respond.
Do you think we are quite close to war on this border?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
President Biden has suggested that he should have a summit. He should meet directly with President Vladimir Putin. What's the response of the Russian government to that?
A summit is always a good thing, but it should be a benchmark of certain achievements. At the moment, we should make a certain analysis on the steps that administration is taken. On the one hand, proclaiming that they would like a good relationship. On the other hand, is that just saying that imposing sanctions and that all. there is no decision about the summit. On our side, we will be analyzing a situation, waiting for what's going to happen. And at some point in time, I can imagine that it might take place. This should be a result of summit, because certain conversations between President Trump and Putin took place, but they did not bring results. They did not brought any improvement in the relationship.
Why isn't Alexei Navalny, now a prisoner in Russia, allowed to see his own doctor?
Navalny has been treated in the hospital, which lies not so far from the place where he is serving his sentence. And as I understand, he does not complain anymore about his place. But it depends, of course. This is not a hospital.
I think he does complain, and his personal doctor was rebuffed when she tried to see him.
How about British prisoners? Do British prisoners request personal doctors?
Well, I'm talking about the Russian situation. Article 99.7 of the Russian Penal Code says that inmates can use their own funds to pay for additional medical, prophylactic and other services provided at their choosing in accordance with the rules of internal procedure of correctional facilities. That is your own penal code, and Russia is still not allowing Navalny to see his doctor.
That's good. Well, I really do not have any recent information about his personal doctor, but I hardly can imagine that in the places of prison, let it be Russian or American or whatever it is, but we have several prisoners in the US, and never a personal doctor has been allowed to see him. There are certain rules in every prison, I do believe also here and in Russia, that are foreseeing the medical treatment. He has got necessary medical treatment, and believe me, we will take care of his medical treatment.
Well, let me read to you what his associates say his condition is now. And this is very recent. He says, he now feels numbness not only in both legs but also in his left hand, along with pain in his back and muscular impairment. They say he is suffering from multiple hernias and protrusions in the spine and a fever and heavy cough. Is the Russian government prepared to let him die in prison?
No, of course, he will not be allowed to die in prison, but I can say that Mr. Navalny, he behaves like a hooligan, absolutely, in trying to violate every rule that has been established. His purpose of all of that is to attract attention for him, also by saying that today his left hand is sick, tomorrow his leg is sick, and all of that stuff. So journalists and attention.
So you don't believe him, but he also says that when he tries to sleep, he's woken up every hour by prison staff, and that would constitute torture.
He was visited by the civil society organization that is looking after the prisons, and we have such an organization, a very important one, and they established that nothing is happening over there. He is sleeping, by the way, in a building where many people are living, and no one is complaining that someone is visiting them and making light up. But I'm not a specialist. All of this is based on the rumors, and I'm reading
based on what his people say, and because no one else is allowed to go in, we've got nothing else to go on. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled that the charges against him for money laundering are, they say, arbitrary and unfair. Isn't the truth that he is in prison because he's a threat to President Putin for democratic reasons?
No, not at all. He has violated his terms of parole, and that is why he has given a sentence. And I have to say that Julian Assange here in Britain was arrested by British police because he has also violated terms of parole.
You say that you don't want Alexei Navalny to die in prison. He is quite clearly very ill. Will you release him?
I think that he will be released. Two things. If he will behave normally, he will have a chance to be released earlier, as in everybody. If he will, of course, continue to violate every rule, then he will have to serve his sentence.
What does normally mean? If he behaves normally, he'll be allowed to be released?
No, I am not going into this situation. There are courts, judges, and those. There is a legal system, of course, and it's not up to the Russian ambassador in the UK to decide what is supposed to be normal. Yes, this is what only I have, I would say, information from different sources.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for talking to us today.
Thank you very much for your good questions.
Coming closer to home and continuing our local election coverage, I'm joined now by Jonathan Bartley, who is co-leader of the Green Party. Mr. Bartley, welcome. Your party says it wants an inquiry into the government's handling of the COVID crisis. In that spirit, I want to put you a few questions about the Green Party and your opinion on some of the really difficult issues that ministers have had to grapple with. So, do you think that people should be allowed to go on holiday abroad this summer?
Good morning, Andrew. What we want to do is follow the science. I think there's consensus on that. What we're very concerned about is that we don't see a proper quarantine system in place already. So if we do go to this traffic light system, then we're worried that it isn't going to be effective. And obviously we need a precautionary principle, as we heard earlier on your programme. The Indian variant is very worrying. We don't know where it's going to lead, but surely the sensible thing is to have on the side of caution, to have a precautionary approach to it. So follow the science, but let's go slowly. Let's make sure we get the right pace of change and not really cut off our nose to spite our face.
So that's fairly close to the government's position. Should people have to show evidence, the so-called vaccine passports, before they go to, for instance, a football game?
No, we're really worried again about the passport system. We worry that it will produce a two-tier system, much better to get the test, trace and isolate system functioning far more effectively. We've long said since April last year, you didn't feature it on your programme, but in April last year, a year ago, we were putting forward proposals for a proper community shield, a test, trace and isolate system at the local level, where the local knowledge is. That'll be far more effective than the tens of billions the government has wasted on companies like Serco.
Well, that's the hospitality area. Should vaccinations be compulsory or mandatory for people working inside care homes?
We don't feel that there should be a jab to work programme and any mandatory requirement for people in workplaces to have the jab. I think in care homes, it is a grey area. Certainly, there should be the encouragement of it to happen, but very, very cautious about making absolutely mandatory.
Right.
Certainly, people not losing their jobs because they won't have the jab, but maybe in terms of new recruitment to posts like that, there should be a requirement that the jab has happened in order to take on new roles.
Again, grey area is very close to what the government's proposing. On that too, you seem to be quite close to the government. Let me move on to another subject. The Green Party praised the French government for banning short-haul flights inside France. And when you did that, you said, and I'm quoting, "Heavy investment in national rail networks is what made this possible. This is climate leadership we need to see." And yet, when it comes to our heavy investment in railways, HS2, you call it ecocide. Straightforward question, which is it?
Well, yeah, HS2 is ecocide. There's a climate and ecological emergency. I think we're in great danger of the new normal being a state of emergency, where we're not thinking about how we adapt to a very, very changed world that we've seen over the last year. We've got to rethink the idea, and HS2 is, of course, a massive commuter line, about why we are intent on moving thousands of people every day from one part of the country to another part of the country, when if we're going to be resilient moving forward, if we have an economy that's going to cope with the crises that we are going to have to deal with, that people could be working far more locally, flexible working from home.
Isn't the answer to that on the HS2 side that it frees up rail to have a much better and more effective local railway system? And if you're against that, how are people going to move around the country? They can't fly and they can't go by train.
Well, my daughter's in Birmingham. I get there perfectly easily. Yes, there is an argument that it'll free up a bit of capacity on the West Coast, but far better to put that money into rejuvenating rail networks right around the country. Surely, Andrew, you're not suggesting that sorts out the problems in Cornwall and Devon by putting an HS2 line up the middle of the country? Of course it doesn't. That's nonsense. We need to take that money, if we were thinking about the future, resilience for the future, and really having a public transport revolution, investing hundreds of millions of pounds in hundreds of communities around the country to rejuvenate local transport systems.
Mr. Bartley, always interesting to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. Now then, I'm joined by the Environment Secretary, George Eustice. Mr. Eustice, you advised David Cameron in the old days. You've been a member of the government and you worked for a lobbying company, Portland, while you were out of government. So you see it from both sides. Can I ask you something very specific? Do you think that what David Cameron has done is acceptable?
Well, look, I think the key thing is he's not broken any of the rules. And you'll recall...
That's not what I'm asking.
Well, I think...
I'm saying, do you think it was acceptable?
Well, it is acceptable for people to work within the rules. Well, I think the point I would make is ministers as they leave office, including prime ministers, aren't allowed to take any such paid roles for a period of 2 years. These are rules that David Cameron himself brought in. He left office some 5 years ago, and you can't begrudge people taking and moving on to do another career. The question is whether...
Is that other career? Let's just remind ourselves that he texted twice the serving Chancellor of the Exchequer. This is the former Prime Minister, texts privately the Chancellor of the Exchequer to see if he can get extra money out of the government for a company that is paying him a lot of money and in which he's got shares. That's Greensill. And he organises separately a private drink with the Health Secretary, again pushing the interests of that company. I suggest to you that this, to a lot of people, appears to be a very undue amount of influence from a former Prime Minister on behalf of a company which has now gone bust, and that, to quote one of my colleagues, it doesn't pass the smell test or the sniff test.
Well, look, he himself conceded that he probably, with hindsight, should have written in a more formal way in a letter through the private office. But the real question here is, what did the Chancellor do when he was contacted? Well, he flagged the conversation with his officials. He asked them to look at it. The answer came back that no, nothing could be done. The company didn't fit the criteria. The company was told, we're not going to help you, and it went bust. So on the face of it, nothing was changed.
Greensill did get public money, and Greensill was heavily involved in aspects of the NHS payment system. Nonetheless, are you really saying, as a government minister, you look at this and you think it's completely fine?
Well, I think always, Andrew, on these things, the issue is less about who someone might have spoken to. The issue always is, how did a minister act after that conversation? And I think it's very clear here to me, from what I can see, that the Chancellor has not acted at all improperly. He flagged it, he looked at it, and then nothing was done on that case.
There are plenty of your colleagues who disagree with you. Bernard Jenkins is a senior Conservative backbencher, a lot of experience in the party, and he said this today. He says, this should matter to Boris Johnson. He doesn't need to pretend to be a saint, and that's lucky, but his red wall voters who gave him his majority will dismiss him unless he can show that he is more open, more transparent, and very different from the out-of-touch elite he defeated in the 2016 referendum and ousted from government.
Yes, well, look, it absolutely does matter to the Prime Minister, which is why he set up a review.
But not to you. You don't think there's a big problem?
No, what I'm saying is there may be a problem, which is why we've set up a review. So Nigel Boardman is going to look at this. He's a non-executive director on the Cabinet Office.
Rachel Reeves says he's very close to the Conservative Party, very close to the government. This is not an independent inquiry of any kind. I don't think... Well,
Rachel Reeves is a Labour politician. She's bound to say that, isn't she? But the key thing is he's an experienced lawyer. He's a non-executive director on the Cabinet Office. He will do a thorough job of getting to the bottom of this and understanding everything around the Greensill issue. We need to let that review take its course, and then we can make a judgment about whether there needs to be any change. There's also a number of parliamentary committees that are looking at it. But I just think it's, on the face of it, basically David Cameron, albeit that he approached the Chancellor...
Trying to twist arms in government
but he didn't get anything for it, and the company went bust. So I think you have to recognise...
And we only know about this thanks to investigative journalists on the Financial Times and the Sunday Times, not because the government's been transparent or open.
Well, actually, the Chancellor was transparent and open, and actually...
Once the story came out,
No, at the time
under Freedom of Information
he declared this with his officials at the time, so that's how it's...
All right. When was the last time that David Cameron contacted you?
Probably a few months ago. I think he'd heard me on the... Farming Today programme.
He wasn't talking about Greensill? Has he ever contacted you?
He's never contacted me about Greensill. I think he knows government well enough to know that DEFRA doesn't have any role on these such affairs.
Do you think that David Cameron should have had to register as a lobbyist?
I think there's a question here, which is what happens when ministers leave office. And so you've got the rules that he himself put in place that restrict what they can do for a period of 2 years. And then there's a register of public affairs companies that's also been established and that David Cameron strengthened the role for.
So just to explain to people, the problem is that register only captures professional consultants. So if I go and work for a bank or another company and I lobby government, or David Cameron lobbies government on behalf of Greensill, they're not in the register, and that seems to a lot of people quite crackers.
Well, it may be something that that is looked at as a result of all of this, and I said there's a number of parliamentary committees that are exploring.
Do you think it should be looked at?
Well, I think the difficulty comes when what if a minister, and they leave office, they for 2 years, they don't do anything at all, but maybe then they take a position as a director or in another company. Principally, they may not be doing any lobbying at all, but what if they then have a conversation with somebody? The right thing in such a situation is that the minister should, declare that conversation's happened and be transparent about it internally, and that's what they do.
This is a perhaps surprisingly robust defence of lobbying from a government minister. The organisation, the charity Transparency International, in 2014 looked into the register we've been talking about, and it found that less than 4% of lobbyists are covered by that register. So simple math says 96% weren't. Surely that's not acceptable.
Well, as I said, this may be something that's looked at, but at the moment we've got these various reviews that are ongoing, including the government one, including Simon Case looking at the issue of...
There's always an ongoing review, come on.
Well, it's not. There's an ongoing review because it's just been set up, but once it's concluded, and once all those parliamentary committees that are now looking at this have concluded, I'm sure some of them will make policy recommendations, and of course the government will look at that. I'm not saying that things couldn't be tweaked or improved, but I am saying that it was changed about 10 years ago, and that fundamentally here the question should be really less about who spoke to who. The question is much more, how did ministers act after those conversations? And on that, as far as I can see, the answer is that Rishi Sunak didn't do any special favours for Greensill or David Cameron.
Who spoke to whom is always important, always interesting. Do you think the public should have a right to know who is lobbying ministers about what and when?
Well, what we already have is a situation where all meetings that ministers have are publicly disclosed, and so those are made available.
Are they indeed? Because I mentioned already the meeting between Lex Greensill, the former Prime Minister David Cameron, and Matt Hancock, that famous private drink. Now, that should have been disclosed. Matt Hancock said that government business was discussed at that meeting. That's why he told officials about it. But if you look at the register we've been talking about, I've gone through it, I've got it here, and all those dates, there is absolutely no mention of Matt Hancock meeting Lex Greensill. There's lots of other people. There's a Royal College of Nurses and Ian Birrell and the Mayor of the West Midlands and Uncle Tom Cobley and all, but not the Greensill meeting. That shows that the system is not working, surely.
Well, I think what it shows is Matt Hancock after that meeting, a private drink that he had, because, as you say...
discussing government business and is not publicly declared.
But it was declared to his officials at the time.
But not to the rest of us.
But it wasn't all, I suppose, it wasn't declared because there were other things potentially that were, I suppose, discussed. But because it was discussed, he declared it with his officials. So I think he was very transparent about that.
Well, I'm sorry, but the system says that the relatively poor system we have at the moment at least says that when there is a meeting of this kind and government business is discussed, it must be declared publicly. And this one wasn't. And I come back to the point, this was uncovered by journalists working for 2 newspapers, and without them, we would know nothing about this at all. The system is not transparent.
Well, I mean, some of the issues that have come out because things have been declared. So some of the meetings that Matt Hancock had, he declared, and people are now seeking to make issue about that.
Not about this.
No, but look, I mean, this is why the Prime Minister said, well, there are questions that have been asked. Let's get to the bottom of these properly. Let's have a review. And so we do now have a review that's going to ask all of these questions. All cabinet ministers will be asked about contacts they had with Lex Greensill, and there'll be a thorough inquiry into this. And then, at the end of that inquiry, we can make a judgment about whether there needs to be some changes to some of these provisions.
Isn't the truth that you don't really think the public has a right to know? You wrote a piece in PR Week in 2011 in which you said, I oppose the idea, muted in some quarters, that politicians should disclose every meeting. Ministers actually exercise judgment based on evidence and become adept at filtering out vested interest lobbying. You're not in favour of those meetings being publicly known.
Well, I think it gets, my point would be that it can get quite complicated. And my argument all along, including in that article, was that fundamentally what matters is how ministers react, not who they talk to. So they'll have constituents that come to them that sometimes raise issues that are relevant to a particular department. I get activists from Extinction Rebellion and green lobby groups coming to me. I get farmers, I get businesses offering ideas and suggestions. Okay. What matters is not who I've spoken to, but whether I'm unduly influenced by the people I speak to, and I'm not.
I'm sorry to jump in, but basically you're saying, let us regulate ourselves, trust ministers, we are above and beyond suspicion. And frankly, out there, the public doesn't agree.
Well, what I'm saying is that we've already got some quite robust systems in place, and the principal one is the Ministerial Code. It is about how ministers conduct themselves based on the people they've talked to. So we should be worried less about who they've talked to, worried much more about are they unduly influenced by individuals. And that's why, they declare meetings they have. It's why they declare financial interests. It's why they declare any other potential interests of family members. And that does happen, and we all do that.
The former Prime Minister, David Cameron, is a big beast in London and in the Conservative Party. When he gets in touch with current ministers, or when he gets in touch, above all, with officials, some of whom he's been at school with, it's not an ordinary meeting between two people at the same level. This is an intervention which can have real effect and give the company that he is working for an advantage for over lots of other companies who haven't employed the former Prime Minister. And that's, to many people, why it's a system that doesn't work and should be reformed.
Well, and look, this is why the Prime Minister set up the review to look at this, and why a number of parliamentary committees are looking at it. I mean, I would say, I think what most former Prime Ministers find is that the tide goes out on their power quite quickly, and they probably, move from a position where everybody hangs on every word to not necessarily
to make their money while they can.
Well, no, it's not so much that. I think there's a question. Right. There's a point here that you can exaggerate this, and the real question is how current incumbents as ministers in government conduct themselves. And I don't see any particular issue with the way either Rishi Sunak or Matt Hancock have done.
Let's turn to coronavirus. Why is India not on the red list?
Well, these things are kept under regular review, and I know there are some concerns about the variant that is in India at the moment, but at the moment the judgment is that the current provisions we have in place, which bear in mind do require quarantine anyway for all countries, do require a pre-departure.
This variant is moving around the country already. We heard that from Susan Hopkins, and to many people, just allowing people in from India while this is happening is reckless or at any rate dilatory.
Well, we're allowing people in from India, provided they've had a pre-departure test, provided they then quarantine, albeit not in a hotel or a designated facility, but quarantine at home, and then have a test at 2 and 8 days. So there are quite a lot of robust tests and checks for everybody coming into the country. But look, we keep this under regular review, and so when we take the advice of the scientific experts on this. If the advice is we should change that and move to a red list, we would.
Are we on track now for all hospitality opening on the 17th of May? And is that dependent on them accepting vaccine passports?
Well, it's too early to say, but I think we are on track in the sense that we are on track with the rollout of the vaccination programme. We've now vaccinated everybody over the age of 50, and this week they're offering vaccination as well to those under the age of 50, starting with the 45 to 49-year-olds. So that bit's on track. But we are being a bit cautious here. So although we've now got 60% of the adult population vaccinated, we do just have to keep a close eye on these variants of concern, and also see what the impacts are of the easements we've just made, the loosenings we've just made before moving to the next stage.
George Eustice, thanks very much indeed for coming in. Now, I'm going to leave you this morning with a little bit of a treat. Simon Armitage, the Poet Laureate, talking about his poem, The Patriarchs. You may have read it. It's an elegy written for the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral yesterday. Earlier, the Poet Laureate told me how he approached writing this particular poem. Until next week, goodbye.
I think over the previous months, I had a few ideas in the back of my head, but on the day that he died, I just started all over again. I took my cue from the weather, which I think is, I suppose, a very British thing to do, and tried to write outward from there. I'd heard a lot of the commentaries at the time about the Duke of Edinburgh disproving of sycophancy and about his duty and his service, and I really wanted to write a poem that extended out from the details of his life and really became a poem about his generation and the things that they represented.
Because he and the Queen are in many ways one of our last physical links to all our yesterdays and that generation. So the war and those people, but also a different way of handling yourself, if I can put it that way, a different way of dealing with the world.
I think so, and I think as younger generations we recognise that in them, that they do seem to have this connection which with a world that's disappearing, over the hill. And I've tried to include those atmospheres and tones in the poem, as well as incorporating, details of the Duke's life himself.
Well, I'm not a poetry critic, but I would say highly successfully. Simon, could you read the poem for us, please?
The Patriarchs, an Elegy. The weather in the window this morning is snow, unseasonal singular flakes, a slow winter's final shiver. On such an occasion, to presume to eulogize one man is to pipe up for a whole generation. That crew whose survival was always the stuff of minor miracle, who came ashore in orange crate coracles, fought ingenious wars, finagled triumphs at sea with flaming decoy boats and sidestep torpedoes. Husbands to duty, they unrolled their plans across billiard tables and vehicle bonnets, regrouped at breakfast. What their secrets were was everyone's guess and nobody's business. Great-grandfathers from birth, in time they became both inner core and outer case in a family heirloom of nesting dolls. Like evidence of early man, their boot prints stand in the hardened earth of rosebeds and borders. They were sons of a zodiac out of sync with the solar year, but turned their minds to the day's big science and heavy questions. To study their hands at rest was to picture maps showing hatchet valleys and indigo streams, schemes of old campaigns and reconnaissance missions. Last of the great avuncular magicians, they kept their best tricks for the grand finale, disproving immortality and disappearing entirely. The major oaks in the wood start tuning up, and skies to come will deliver their tributes. But for now, a cold April's closing moments parachute slowly home. So by mid-afternoon, snow is recast as seed heads and thistledown.